In the bitter winter of 1838, amidst the snow-covered hills of eastern Kentucky, a discovery was made that would forever alter our understanding of human depravity. 27 bodies, aged from mere infants to elderly individuals, were found, preserved in the attic of what appeared to be a respectable family home. The locals called it the Whitmore residence, but those who discovered the gruesome scene would come to know it as the House of Silent Sorrows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The local magistrate's journal, hidden for nearly a century in the Boone County Records Office, described scenes so disturbing that 2 of the investigating officers resigned their positions within days. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the horror of what was discovered, but the chilling realization that Josephine and Elias Whitmore had been operating their twisted enterprise for almost 15 years without arousing suspicion. The townsfolk called them pillars of the community, but the truth behind that reputation would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of the Whitmore family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then and continues to perplex historians today is how such a massive operation could have gone undetected for so long in a close-knit rural community. The Kentucky of 1838 was a land of contradictions. The promise of westward expansion brought waves of settlers seeking new beginnings, while established communities maintained rigid social hierarchies and unspoken rules of conduct. In this environment, the small settlement of Mill Creek, a collection of perhaps 40 families spread across the fertile valley of Boone County, represented the typical American frontier community of the era. Most residents farmed tobacco, or corn, traded at Hargrove's General Store, and gathered for social events at the wooden church that served as the heart of community life. The Whitmore property sat on the northern edge of this community, a stately 2-story brick house surrounded by nearly 150 acres of prime agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the dirt road that connected Mill Creek to Lexington, Whitmore home appeared to be the very picture of frontier prosperity. The house itself, built in the Federal style popular during the 1820s, featured symmetrical windows, elegant columns supporting a small front portico, and neatly tended gardens that suggested refinement and taste. A large barn stood about 70 yards behind the house, with various outbuildings completing the picture of a successful farm. What made the Whitmore property unique wasn't visible from the road. Elias Whitmore, who had purchased the land in 1823 with money from his successful medical practice in Philadelphia, had spent considerable effort modifying the home's attic. While most Kentucky homes of the period featured simple storage spaces, under their roofs the Whitmore attic had been extensively reinforced, insulated, and divided into multiple chambers. Local carpenters remembered being hired for various construction projects throughout the 1820s, though none had seen the completed work. Elias paid generously and in gold, asking only that the workers focus on their assigned sections rather than the overall design. Josephine Whitmore, Elias's wife, had arrived in Mill Creek in 1823 as a bride of 27. Neighbors remembered her as a striking woman with auburn hair and an unusually melodious voice. She dressed in the latest fashions ordered from Philadelphia, attended the Presbyterian church services with perfect regularity, and maintained a reputation for exceptional hospitality. When approached about contributing to community causes, Josephine would explain that she and Elias were already providing significant support to medical research and education back east. The arrangement, she explained, was their way of advancing scientific knowledge while helping those in need. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional strange deliveries to the Whitmore property. Mrs. Hargrove, at the general store, would sometimes see unusual crates being unloaded from wagons that arrived late in the evening. The deliveries were always handled with great care, but Josephine would explain that they contained fragile scientific instruments or specimens for Elias's medical research. The community, proud to have such an educated and progressive doctor in their midst, accepted these explanations without question. Thomas Hargrove, who ran the general store, later recalled that Josephine Whitmore was one of his most particular customers. Every 10 days, she would arrive with a meticulously detailed list and enough money to purchase substantial quantities of unusual supplies, special salts, alcohol, various herbs and chemicals, along with large amounts of linen and beeswax. The quantities seemed excessive for a childless couple, but when Thomas inquired, Josephine would remind him about Elias's important scientific work. She also purchased unusual amounts of basic medicines, explaining that her husband was conducting research that would eventually benefit the entire community. The Whitmore home operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families followed the natural rhythms of daylight, activity at the Whitmore property often continued. Throughout the night, lights could be seen in the upper windows at all hours, and the sound of movement sometimes echoed across the fields during the darkest hours. When asked about these activities, Elias would explain that scientific observation required vigilance at all hours and that the advancement of medical knowledge waited for no man. Reverend Jonathan Pembroke, the Presbyterian minister who served the Mill Creek congregation, remembered being particularly impressed by the Whitmore's generosity. During his monthly visits to the home, Reverend Pembroke would receive substantial donations for the church and listen to Elias's passionate descriptions of the medical advances he was pursuing. When the minister inquired about visiting Elias's laboratory to see this important work, Josephine would always interject that the sensitive nature of the research required absolute sterility and isolation. The process, she assured him, simply couldn't risk contamination from outside visitors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What none of the community members realized was that Josephine and Elias Whitmore had been perfecting their deception for over a decade. The scientific research was not devoted to saving lives, but to an obsession far more macabre, the preservation of human bodies. The unusual deliveries were not scientific instruments, but corpses, purchased from grave robbers, acquired from poorhouses, or obtained through more sinister means. The Whitmores weren't advancing medical science. They were creating a private collection of preserved human specimens that would make the most hardened anatomist recoil in horror. The discovery that would expose the Whitmore family's horrific secrets began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the early months of 1838. January had brought unprecedented snowfall, with drifts reaching the second-story windows of many homes. The bitter cold that gripped Kentucky that winter would prove to be both the Whitmores' undoing and the key to understanding the full scope of their activities. On January 17, 1838, a traveling doctor named Frederick Morton was making his way from Lexington to Cincinnati when a blinding snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Whitmore home, being the most substantial building visible from the road, seemed like a natural choice for emergency accommodation. Elias Whitmore, despite obvious reluctance, could hardly refuse hospitality to a fellow physician during such dangerous weather. Morton later described the evening as unnervingly tense. Josephine Whitmore served an elaborate meal of roast duck and imported wine, but conversation was strained and artificial. The Whitmores seemed nervous, constantly exchanging glances and reacting with alarm to any noise from the floors above. When Morton inquired about Elias's medical research, hoping to engage in professional discussion, the host became evasive and quickly changed the subject. Josephine explained that her husband's work was of a confidential nature, under commission from a prestigious Philadelphia medical school. What disturbed Morton most was the smell. Throughout the night, as he lay in the guest bedroom, he detected what his medical training identified as the distinctive odor of preservation chemicals, alcohol, formaldehyde, and other substances used in anatomical studies. When he mentioned this to Elias the next morning, Whitmore claimed it was simply the normal smell of his laboratory work. The odor was unavoidable in any serious medical research, he explained. Morton accepted this explanation, as it aligned with his own experiences in medical school, but something about the Whitmore's manner continued to trouble him. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later on February 8th. Samuel Jenkins, a carpenter who had previously worked on the Whitmore home, arrived to repair damage caused by the winter storms. While examining the roof, he noticed that one section near the chimney was significantly warmer than the surrounding areas, despite the freezing temperatures. Snow had melted in a perfect rectangle, suggesting that the attic below was being heated to an unusual degree. When Jenkins mentioned this observation to Elias, the doctor became visibly agitated. He dismissed the carpenter immediately, paying him for a full day's work despite the job being incomplete, and insisted that he would handle the remaining repairs himself. Jenkins thought this behavior odd but assumed it had something to do with the doctor's mysterious research. He mentioned the incident to his wife, who told her friend Mrs. Hargrove, adding another piece to the puzzle that was slowly forming in the community's collective awareness. The final incident that would lead to the discovery occurred on February 27, 1838. A local hunter named William Crawford was tracking deer in the woods that bordered the Whitmore property when a gust of wind carried a strange odor to his nostrils. The smell was pungent and chemical, completely out of place in the winter forest. Crawford, curious about the source, followed the scent to the back of the Whitmore property. As he approached, he noticed a small outbuilding he hadn't seen before, partially hidden among the trees. From this structure came not only the strange smell, but also the sound of Elias Whitmore's voice. Crawford crept closer to investigate, concealing himself behind a large oak tree about 30 yards from the building. For nearly half an hour, he watched and listened. Elias emerged several times, carrying what appeared to be sealed jars containing dark objects. He transported these jars carefully from the outbuilding to the main house, taking a path that led to a rarely used side entrance. On his final trip, a jar slipped from his hands and shattered on the frozen ground. Crawford witnessed Elias frantically gathering up what appeared to be a preserved human hand, wrapping it in a cloth, and hurrying into the house. Crawford, deeply disturbed by what he had seen, reported the incident to Magistrate Howard Collins. The next morning, Collins, a methodical and cautious man who had served Boone County for over 12 years, initially suspected that Crawford had witnessed nothing more sinister than a doctor handling medical specimens. Such items, while distasteful to the general public, were necessary tools of the medical profession. However, when Crawford insisted that the preserved appendage appeared to be that of a child, Collins agreed to investigate. On the morning of March 2, 1838, Magistrate Collins rode out to the Whitmore property, accompanied by 2 deputies, Jacob Reeves and Michael Donovan. They arrived just before noon, expecting to conduct a brief, routine inquiry that would clear up what was likely a misunderstanding. Josephine Whitmore met them at the door, her manner initially welcoming, but quickly turning guarded when Collins explained the purpose of their visit. The conversation began cordially enough. Josephine invited the officers into the parlor while explaining that her husband was away on business in Lexington. She expressed shock at the accusations and suggested that Mr. Crawford must have misinterpreted what he saw. The specimen was most certainly from a monkey, she explained, part of Elias's comparative anatomy studies. Many of the doctor's specimens came from animals, she assured them, acquired legally from menageries and scientific suppliers in the East. Everything might have ended there, with the officers accepting Josephine's plausible explanation, had Deputy Reeves not requested to use the privy. As he walked through the house, he noticed something unusual, a narrow staircase hidden behind a false bookcase that had been left slightly ajar. When he returned to the parlor and quietly informed Magistrate Collins about what he had observed, both men realized that a more thorough inspection was warranted. Collins politely asked Josephine to show them the upper floors of the house, explaining that a quick look would help dismiss any concerns and put the matter to rest. The change in Josephine Whitmore's demeanor was immediate and alarming. Her face drained of color. Her hands began to tremble, and she started insisting that the upper rooms were private, that they contained her husband's valuable research, that no one was permitted to enter without Elias's express permission. That was when they heard it. From somewhere above their heads came a distinct thump, followed by what sounded like glass containers clinking together. The noise was too substantial to be caused by the wind or settling of the house. Someone was moving around in the attic. Despite Josephine's claim that she was alone, the immediate aftermath of that discovery would haunt Magistrate Collins for the remainder of his life. When he and his deputies forced their way past Josephine and climbed the hidden staircase to the attic, the scene that greeted them defied comprehension. The odor that hit them was overpowering, a noxious blend of chemical preservatives, decay, and something else that Collins later described as the smell of perverted science. The attic that Elias Whitmore had spent over 15 years constructing was a monument to obsession. The space stretched the entire length of the substantial house, divided into carefully organized sections. The main chamber, directly accessible from the hidden staircase, contained row upon row of glass cases. Within each case was a human body, preserved through a combination of chemical treatments and an innovative dry preservation technique that had kept the corpses in a remarkable state of conservation. The bodies were arranged chronologically, from infants to elderly individuals, each meticulously posed and labeled with details of their age, physical characteristics, and the date of their acquisition. The preservation was so perfect that many appeared to be simply sleeping, their skin taut and waxy, but maintaining a disturbing semblance of life. Some had been partially dissected, with careful incisions revealing internal organs that had also been preserved. Others were intact, their expressions frozen in what appeared to be their final moments. What struck the officers most forcefully was the artistry involved. These weren't haphazard medical specimens, but carefully arranged tableaux. Families were posed together, their hands touching. Children held toys. Adults were dressed in fine clothes. Each display case contained small personal items, rings, watches, lockets, as if Elias had attempted to capture not just the bodies, but some essence of the lives these people had led. Deputy Donovan, a veteran of the War of 1812, had to leave the attic twice to vomit in the snow outside. Magistrate Collins, despite his years of experience with frontier justice, found himself unable to process the full scope of what he was seeing, the methodical nature of the collection, the evidence of years of careful work, the sheer number of bodies. It was beyond anything in his experience or imagination. In smaller rooms adjoining the main chamber, Collins and Reeves found evidence of the Whitmore system of acquisition and preservation. One room contained detailed journals documenting Elias's techniques, experiments with different preservation methods, and his evolving artistic vision for his collection. Another held correspondence with grave robbers, corrupt officials at poorhouses, and other suppliers who had provided bodies over the years. A third room contained the chemicals and tools used in the preservation process, arranged with the precision of a master craftsman's workshop. The records revealed the scope of the Whitmore operation. Bodies had been arriving at the farm regularly. Since shortly after Elias and Josephine moved to Kentucky in 1823, the sources varied. Some were legitimately purchased from medical schools when specimens were no longer needed. Others were stolen from graves throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. Still others had more troubling provenances. Individuals who had died in poorhouses with no family to claim them. Travelers who had fallen ill while passing through the area. And in the most disturbing cases, people who appeared to have been healthy before coming into contact with the Whitmores. The obvious question, whether some of these individuals had been alive when they came into the Whitmores' possession, was answered in the most horrifying way possible. In a small, locked room at the far end of the attic, Collins found Elias Whitmore himself, working on his newest acquisition. The body of a young woman, whom Collins would later identify as Rebecca Turner, a domestic servant who had gone missing from a neighboring county 2 weeks earlier, was laid out on a table. The condition of the body and Elias's detailed notes made it clear that Rebecca had been alive when brought to the Whitmore home, kept sedated with various compounds until Elias was ready to preserve her. When confronted, Elias showed neither remorse nor resistance. He spoke calmly, even proudly, of his collection and his contribution to science. He explained to the horrified magistrate that he was creating the most comprehensive study of human physical development ever assembled, preserving examples of humanity at every stage of life. In his mind, he was not a murderer but a visionary, creating an archive of human physical forms that would educate generations to come. The investigation that followed the initial discovery would continue for months as authorities struggled to understand how such a massive operation had functioned undetected for over 15 years. The answer lay in Josephine and Elias Whitmore's genius for deception and their understanding of social expectations in frontier Kentucky. They had created personas that were almost perfectly designed to avoid suspicion in a rural 1830s community. The character of the dedicated physician conducting important research appealed to the community's respect for education and progress, while explaining away any unusual aspects of the Whitmore household. The claim that the research was commissioned by prestigious Eastern institutions provided a ready excuse for secrecy. The Whitmores' generosity to the church and community causes established them as respectable citizens above reproach. Even more cleverly, the Whitmores had created multiple layers of protection for their operation. Their home was designed to keep their activities hidden, with the false bookcase concealing the staircase to the attic, and the main house presenting a perfect picture of refinement and normality. The unusual supplies they purchased were explained by Elias's medical research, while their strange hours could be attributed to the demands of scientific observation. The physical setup of the operation was equally well planned. The attic had been constructed with thick insulation that muffled sounds and helped maintain the cool, dry environment needed for preservation. The chemical processes had been refined to minimize odors that might escape the house. The outbuilding where initial preparations took place was hidden from view of both the road and neighboring properties. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychology behind the Whitmores' activities. Neither Elias nor Josephine showed any recognition that their actions were wrong. In lengthy interviews following their arrest, both spoke of their collection with pride, describing it as their legacy and contribution to human knowledge. They genuinely seemed to believe that future generations would recognize the value of their work and thank them for it. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete shock and profound betrayal. Many residents initially refused to believe that Elias and Josephine Whitmore, who had lived among them for over 15 years, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some suggested that Elias must have gone mad, that his scientific obsessions had overwhelmed an otherwise decent mind. These denials became impossible to maintain as more evidence emerged. The detailed records found in the attic included not just information about the bodies, but also correspondence with others who shared Elias's macabre interests. The Whitmores had been part of a network of collectors who traded preservation techniques, competed for rare specimens, and occasionally exchanged bodies with specific characteristics. The Whitmore collection was just one manifestation of a darker undercurrent in early American scientific inquiry, where the boundaries between legitimate medical research and disturbing personal obsession often blurred. As Magistrate Collins delved deeper into the Whitmore case, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested the operation was far more calculated than initially believed. The correspondence found in the attic revealed that Elias had been in regular contact with at least 7 other individuals across 4 states, all apparently involved in similar activities. The letters, written in elaborate terminology that disguised their true meaning from casual readers, discussed acquisitions, preservation techniques, and display methodologies in language that clearly referred to the collection and preservation of human remains. One letter dated just 2 months before the discovery came from someone identified only as H.M. In Boston, H.M. wrote that he had acquired a remarkable specimen of advanced age with the most extraordinary arterial structure that would complement your developmental series beautifully. The letter included a detailed description of an elderly man with unusual anatomical features, along with a proposal for exchanging this specimen for 2 of Elias's juvenile subjects. The financial records painted an equally disturbing picture. Elias Whitmore had been paying substantial sums to grave robbers, corrupt cemetery caretakers, and poorhouse officials who could provide fresh bodies. He had also been receiving payments from other collectors, suggesting that the Whitmore collection served as both a personal obsession and a commercial enterprise. The total amount of money involved was staggering for the time period, over $12,000, in transactions over 15 years, equivalent to hundreds of thousands in modern currency. Reverend Pembroke, who had been so impressed by the Whitmore's generosity to his church, became a key witness as the investigation expanded. Under questioning, he revealed that Elias had shown particular interest in funeral arrangements within the community, often volunteering to help with preparations when someone died. The minister had thought this simply another example of the doctor's community spirit, but in retrospect, it appeared to be a way for Elias to identify potential specimens and gain access to fresh burials. The testimony of local businessman Thomas Hargrove provided additional pieces of the puzzle. A review of his sales records showed that Josephine Whitmore had been purchasing increasing quantities of preservation chemicals over the years. What appeared to be the growing needs of a dedicated researcher was actually evidence of an expanding collection. Hargrove also remembered specific requests for items that seemed unusual at the time: specialized glass containers, fine instruments imported from Europe, and materials used in the construction of display cases. The investigation also revealed the role of Josephine Whitmore in the operation. While Elias appeared to be the driving force behind the collection itself, Josephine was responsible for managing their public persona and creating the social smokescreen that had hidden their activities for so long. Several of the surviving letters showed that she was far more than an accessory. She was an active participant who shared her husband's vision and contributed her own ideas to the artistic presentation of their specimens. The most disturbing revelation came from analyzing the records of individuals in the Whitmore collection. Of the 27 bodies discovered in the attic, at least 9 appeared to have been alive when they came into the Whitmore's possession. These victims shared certain characteristics. They were typically travelers or individuals without strong local connections, people whose disappearances would not generate extensive searches or inquiries. The methodical documentation kept by Elias provided chilling insights into his process. For living subjects, he had developed a system of administering carefully calibrated doses of sedatives, keeping victims unconscious while he prepared his preservation chemicals. His journals contained detailed observations of how different individuals reacted to various sedatives, how long they remained effective, and how to ensure that the final preservation captured what he called the essence of living form, rather than the collapsed appearance of natural death. The scope of the investigation expanded as authorities in other states began examining their own unsolved disappearances. Missing persons reports from Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania showed disturbing similarities. Many of the missing individuals fit the profile of those found in the Whitmore collection, people who had vanished while traveling alone, often in areas where Elias Whitmore had been known to visit for medical conferences or research expeditions. Federal marshals were called in to coordinate the multi-state investigation, an unusual step for the time period when most law enforcement was strictly local. The Whitmore case represented one of the first major criminal investigations to cross state lines and involve federal authorities. The legal implications were complicated by the fact that many of the crimes had occurred in different jurisdictions under different laws. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about how the Whitmores had selected their victims. They had developed a sophisticated system for identifying vulnerable individuals, travelers staying at local inns, people visiting Kentucky without family connections, workers who had recently arrived in the area seeking employment. Josephine would often make initial contact, using her charm and social standing to gain their trust. Elias would then follow up, sometimes offering medical treatment for minor ailments or offering employment at his property. The investigation uncovered evidence of the Whitmores' methods for acquiring victims. They had developed relationships with stagecoach drivers and innkeepers who would alert them when suitable travelers arrived in the area. They had cultivated contacts among those who managed poorhouses and almshouses who would provide information about individuals who died without family to claim them. They had even established connections with cemetery caretakers in several counties who would look the other way when fresh graves were disturbed. Perhaps most chillingly, the records showed that the Whitmore operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of bodies being preserved had increased, and there were plans in the correspondence for establishing a larger, more permanent display space. The discovery at the Whitmore farm had apparently interrupted a criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming a much more ambitious undertaking. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete exposure of the Whitmore network came from an unexpected source. Among the correspondence found in the attic was a series of letters from a Boston physician named Harrison Mortimer. The letters described the shared interest in anatomical preservation and included references to Mortimer's own collection. When federal marshals investigated, they discovered that Mortimer was a respected member of the Boston medical community, who had been maintaining his own preserved collection of human remains for over 20 years. Mortimer's position differed from the Whitmores in significant ways. As a legitimate physician and instructor at Harvard Medical School, he had legal access to unclaimed bodies for dissection and study. However, the investigation revealed that his collection went far beyond what was necessary for medical education. Like Elias Whitmore, he had developed an obsession with preserving human specimens in lifelike conditions, creating elaborate displays that blurred the line between scientific study and macabre art. When confronted with evidence of his connection to the Whitmores, Mortimer initially attempted to defend his activities as legitimate medical research. However, as investigators uncovered more correspondence that clearly discussed the acquisition of living subjects, Mortimer agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. His testimony provided a comprehensive picture of a network of collectors that stretched across the eastern United States. Mortimer's information revealed that the Whitmore case was not an isolated incident, but part of a disturbing subculture that had developed within certain medical circles. A small group of physicians, anatomists, and private collectors had been exchanging preservation techniques, trading specimens, and even collaborating on acquisitions for decades. Some, like Mortimer himself, operated primarily within legal boundaries, using their positions to obtain unclaimed bodies. Others, like the Whitmores, had moved into outright murder to supply their collections. The most significant revelation came when Mortimer described an annual gathering that had occurred for the past 8 years. These meetings, disguised as medical conferences, brought together collectors from across the country to share techniques, display their most prized specimens, and arrange exchanges. Mortimer's description of these gatherings painted a picture of individuals who had created their own moral universe, one in which the advancement of anatomical knowledge and the creation of permanent archives of human form justified any action. Mortimer's testimony included names, dates, and locations that allowed federal marshals to coordinate raids on multiple properties across 5 states. These operations were conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of suspects. The results of the coordinated raids were staggering. Over 40 additional preserved bodies were discovered in collections maintained by 7 different individuals. Physical evidence was seized that documented the full extent of the network, including correspondence, financial records, and journals detailing preservation techniques. Several prominent individuals were arrested, including 2 professors from respected medical schools, a wealthy Boston merchant who maintained a private museum of curiosities, and a Pennsylvania doctor who had been supplying fresh bodies to the network for over a decade. The evidence seized during the raids painted a picture of systematic depravity that shocked the nation. The network had been operating for more than 30 years, had involved dozens of individuals at various levels of participation, and had victimized scores of people. The Whitmore's techniques, which had been documented in meticulous detail in Elias's journals, were particularly disturbing to medical authorities who reviewed the evidence. Elias had developed a preservation method that combined traditional embalming with innovative drying techniques, allowing him to maintain the appearance of lifelike tissue indefinitely. The process involved the injection of various chemical compounds into the vascular system, followed by carefully controlled dehydration and the application of specialty waxes and resins to the skin. What made the technique particularly valuable to collectors was its ability to preserve the appearance of life. The faces of the victims maintained expressions. The bodies could be posed in natural positions, and the overall effect was dramatically different from traditional anatomical specimens preserved in alcohol. Elias had been particularly proud of his ability to preserve the natural coloration of the skin and eyes, creating specimens that appeared to be merely sleeping rather than dead. The investigation also revealed the corruption that had made the network possible. Officials at poorhouses had been bribed to provide bodies or to ignore their disappearances. Cemetery caretakers had been paid to look the other way when graves were disturbed. Even some local law enforcement officials had been involved in covering up evidence or discouraging investigations into missing persons when the victims were transients or individuals without local connections. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years as prosecutors struggled to bring justice to victims of crimes that had occurred across multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and social connections of many of the defendants, made prosecution extremely difficult. Several key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. However, the public exposure of the preservation network had profound effects that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The Whitmore case became a catalyst for the first federal legislation addressing the treatment of human remains and the transportation of bodies across state lines. It led to reforms in the oversight of medical schools and the use of cadavers for study, and to the establishment of new legal protections for the deceased and their families. The final resolution of the Whitmore case would take nearly 4 years to complete, but its impact on American society was immediate and profound. The public reaction to the revelations was one of horrified fascination mixed with a determination to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Newspapers across the country covered the story in unprecedented detail, with many publications dedicating entire issues to the investigation's findings. The fate of the victims preserved in the Whitmore collection presented authorities with a difficult moral and practical dilemma. Many of the bodies were decades old, making identification and return to families nearly impossible. Others had been altered so significantly through the preservation process that traditional burial would be difficult. After much deliberation and consultation with religious authorities, a decision was made to hold a collective funeral service for all the victims, followed by burial in a specially consecrated section of the Boone County Cemetery. The ceremony, held on a cold November day in 1838, was attended by over 2,000 people from throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. Reverend Pembroke, still struggling with his own feelings of guilt for having been deceived by the Whitmores, delivered a moving eulogy that emphasized the dignity of the victims and the community's commitment to remembering them not as specimens, but as human beings deserving of respect and compassion. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the corruption that had enabled the preservation network. Elias Whitmore, who had been captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple charges of murder, grave robbery, and desecration of human remains. He was executed by hanging in Lexington on September 8, 1840, before a crowd of several thousand people. His final statement, according to witnesses, expressed no remorse, but rather disappointment that his scientific contribution had not been appreciated. Josephine Whitmore's trial became a sensation that exposed the role of women in the criminal enterprise. Unlike her husband, Josephine attempted to portray herself as an unwilling participant who had been coerced into assisting with his macabre obsession. However, the evidence from their correspondence revealed her as an enthusiastic partner who had contributed her own ideas to the collection and played a crucial role in maintaining their respectable public image. She was convicted of being an accessory to multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. She died in the Kentucky State Prison for Women in 1852, reportedly of tuberculosis. Harrison Mortimer's cooperation with authorities earned him reduced sentence, but the exposure of his activities destroyed his medical career and social standing. He served 8 years in prison before being released, after which he disappeared from public record. Rumors suggested that he had changed his name and relocated to Europe, where attitudes toward anatomical collections were somewhat more permissive. The investigation's most frustrating aspect was the number of powerful individuals who escaped justice despite clear evidence of their involvement. Several wealthy collectors fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political and social connections to avoid prosecution or to receive minimal sentences that didn't reflect the severity of their crimes. A prominent Philadelphia surgeon who had purchased multiple specimens from the Whitmores was censured by his medical society but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation revealed that the preservation network had generated substantial profits for its participants. Elias and Josephine Whitmore alone had accumulated over $15,000 in profits from their activities, a sum equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Much of this money was never recovered as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't trace. The Whitmore house itself became a symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction, but no one wanted to live in a place associated with such evil. The house remained vacant for nearly a decade, falling into disrepair and becoming the subject of local ghost stories and legends. It was finally destroyed by fire in 1849. An event that many local residents viewed as cleansing rather than tragic. The case led to significant reforms in medical education and the treatment of human remains. Kentucky passed comprehensive legislation governing the use of cadavers for medical study, establishing strict oversight of anatomical collections, and requiring detailed documentation of the source of all human remains used in medical schools. Other states quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern ethical standards in medical education. The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and the transportation of human remains across state lines. The Whitmore case had demonstrated the limitations of state-by-state law enforcement when dealing with crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. New federal statutes gave marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute similar cases, establishing precedents that would prove crucial in later criminal justice developments. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of travelers and those without strong community connections. The romantic notion of the respected doctor and his charitable wife was replaced by a more realistic understanding of how appearances could conceal the darkest of intentions. The phrase, "a Whitmore collection," entered common usage as a warning about hidden evil behind respectable facades. Dr. Frederick Morton, the traveling physician who had unknowingly spent a night in the Whitmore home just weeks before the discovery, dedicated the rest of his career to reforming medical education. He established ethical guidelines for the acquisition and use of anatomical specimens and became an outspoken critic of the secretive traditions that had allowed the preservation network to flourish. His later writings on medical ethics were influenced heavily by his experience with the Whitmore case. Magistrate Howard Collins, who had led the initial investigation, was appointed to a federal position focused on coordinating interstate criminal investigations. He spent the remainder of his career developing investigative techniques for cases that crossed state lines, creating protocols that would become standard practice in American law enforcement. Collins's detailed reports on the Whitmore case became required reading for law enforcement officers throughout the expanding United States. The network's correspondence, which had been preserved as evidence, provided investigators with information that led to additional cases for years after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Whitmore attic contained references to other collections, other victims, and other practitioners of the macabre preservation arts. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed to gather sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the realization that the Whitmore operation had been just one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed, largely undetected for decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks had operated in other parts of the country, that human remains had been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history, and that the legal and social systems had been inadequate to protect even the dead from exploitation. The case also highlighted the role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. The residents of Mill Creek, who had lived for 15 years next to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-examination. How had they failed to see what was happening? What signs had they missed or ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant or suspicious? These questions led to broader discussions about the obligation of communities to look beyond appearances and to question behaviors that seemed unusual, even when exhibited by respected members of society. The Whitmore case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting explanations without investigation, of respecting privacy when that respect enabled criminal behavior, and of assuming that social standing guaranteed moral conduct. The legacy of the Whitmore case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it inspired. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including the correspondence, journals, and testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the dark undercurrents of early American medical practice. Historians, criminologists, and medical ethicists would study the case for generations, using it to understand how scientific obsession could cross the boundary into criminal depravity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.